We're going to get started. So, just so you know, to be here for a session on colonialism as property, whiteness as colonialism. It's a very provocative title for a very provocative panel and really brilliant papers. I had the pleasure of reading iterations of these papers, which is why I'm not going to say too much in the introduction, because I know some people may not get down to 15 minutes. But I really want to hear catastrophic discussion. This whole enterprise is really a provocation, I think, in keeping with the spirit of Cheryl's essay. The panel examines manifestations of white supremacy, colonialism, anti-colonialism in the U.S., Israel, Palestine, and West Asia more generally, demonstrating that colonialism is indeed a constitutive factor in U.S. and Israel prevailing racial formation, civil rights and immigration policies and social movements. In the papers, it's specifically at 19th century examples of black anti-colonialism, the role of Iranian students in emerging U.S. radical politics, how they challenge whiteness and assimilation. It's a form of anti-colonial practice. The case of the LA 8 Palestinian activist in one Kenyan jail in 1987 under the Walter McCarran law, and the reflections on the global impact of Israeli Southern Colonial Project. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and as you see, one person is missing, Majid. I'm Majid today. And we know Majid smokes all the time, so I don't smoke. But I'll be reading his paper, he sent it, version of it. So in order in which they were speaking, I'll just give very, very brief introductions. First, we're going to hear from Justin Roy, postdoctoral fellow at the Charles Warren Center for American History at Harvard University. He holds a PhD in American Studies from NYU, where he wrote a dissertation titled Race, Empire, and the Global Intellectual Tradition of the Black Planet, 1750 to 1850. His paper is entitled Slavery, Southern Colonialism, and the History of Black Anti-Imperialism. Then we'll hear from Majid, reading his paper. Majid is a professor at the Institute of International Studies in Birzeit University, author of Not Just a Soccer Game, Colonialism and Conflict Among Palestinians in Israel. He's also was one of the key figures in getting the ASA resolution on boycott of Israel, Israeli academic institutions passed, and he was also my guide when I went to Palestine. Very wonderful person. His talk, what I'll be giving, is entitled Israel in Asia, Israel in the Globe, Southern Colonialism and Rupture. And then we'll hear from Manija Nasrabadi, who's also an NYU PhD in American Studies. NYU produces like the smartest people. She's a really great scholar. She's currently UC President's postdoctoral fellow in Asian American Studies at UC Davis. Her work emphasizes gender and sexuality studies. Her research examines political cultures of the Iranian diaspora in the U.S., tracing generational shifts in subjectivity, transnational activism, and cultural production across the historical arc of U.S.-Iran relations. Her paper is entitled Imperial Model Minorities Gone Rogue, Iranian foreign students in the Revolutionary Convergence, and there's some shocking things in that paper I didn't even know. And then we'll finally hear from, last but not least, Nina Farnia, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of History at UC Davis. She studies U.S. colonialism and the racialization of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, among other things. She also holds a law degree from this place, UCLA, and has worked, in the law. Her articles have appeared in many, many journals, including the Journal of Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, UCLA Women's Law Journal, Middle East Report, the Daily Journal, Bajan's Iranian Feminist Magazine, and Tehran Avenue. First we can hear from Justin.
Hello for coming. So as Robin alluded to, last December, the American Studies Association voted to boycott Israeli academic institutions. The boycott vote was a response to calls from Palestinian civil society and is part of the larger BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. The vote quickly came to national attention, and over 250 college and university administrations condemned the ASA. The most common charge was that boycotts infringe upon the foundational right of academic freedom. They, of course, remained silent on the question of academic freedom for Palestinians. However, many critics also asked why a professional organization dedicated to the study of race and culture in the United States would be concerned with Middle East politics. To me, this question smacked of willful ignorance, but it did provide an opportunity to reflect on how my field, which is early African American history, has struggled to articulate its relationship to various forms of empire. So despite the prominent turn to the study of empire in US history more generally, scholarly work on Black political thought remains largely invested in questions centered on rights, freedom, and citizenship. While there's a strong body of scholarship that draws the history of Black internationalist politics in the US as far back as the interwar period, scholars have tended to ignore the 18th and 19th century antecedents. The depth of radical Black internationalism in the 20th century has received serious attention in the past decade. But no matter how strong such work is, its relatively narrow chronological focus means we run the risk of mistaking the middle decades of the 20th century as a brilliant but passing moment, an untenable exception to the status quo, rather than one of the most defining and sustained characteristics of Black radical thought. To compound the problem, currently one of the most popular ideas in African American studies is that Black racialization emerges at the edge of humanity. That is, the category Black is defined by its exclusion from the category of human. In such a formulation, Black, non-Black is the primary division of the modern social order exemplified by slavery and its legacies. The Black, non-Black dichotomy has allowed us to more fully understand the particular nature of anti-Black racism, but it obscures how central the language of colonization and colonialism has figured into Black theorizations of racism. One thinks of Fanon's famous claim, colonial racism is no different than any other racism, or Emery Baraka's comparison of Black struggles to anti-colonial struggles with his pithy statement, in America, Black is a country. Not to mention James Baldwin's description of Harlem as occupied territory in the 1960s. So I won't quote it here in the interest of time, but Whiteness as Property actually gives us very useful language for thinking beyond this intellectual impasse. Harris reminds us that it was property rights in Black bodies and property rights in Native American land that were the foundations of the US nation state. And she was one of the earliest scholars to really think about settler colonialism and slavery within the same frame. And so although we can't reduce anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism to variations on the same, we also can't theorize them in isolation. I think both Black studies and Native studies still struggle with how not to give up the specificity of different forms of racial violence while simultaneously recognizing the inextricability of those different forms. And really it's only by thinking about Blackness and empire together that we can start to make sense of some of the images that I've been showing. So with my remaining time, I'd like to highlight several moments in which Black intellectuals, writers, and rebels consider the relationship of Blackness to empire and settler colonialism before returning to the question of Black Palestinian solidarity and why the boycott of Israeli institutions is relevant to African American studies. 1. James Roberts was born enslaved in Maryland in 1753. He fought alongside his master during the American Revolution. After the war, instead of being set free as he expected, Roberts was sent back to Maryland to be sold. He eventually found himself on a Louisiana plantation and was inspired to fight again in the War of 1812 by Andrew Jackson's promise that slaves who fought for the nation would receive their freedom. After the war, however, Jackson substituted praise for Black soldiers' bravery on the battlefield for his promise to freedom. Roberts was incensed by this second betrayal. In 1858, on the eve of yet another war, Roberts published a narrative of his life at the age of 108. When he reflected on his experience in the Continental Army, he wrote, "I helped to scalp and kill many Indians, which I now exceedingly regret, as they were innocent and defenseless and were fast tending to a condition not much better than my own." In the 8 intervening decades, Roberts came to a crucial truth. Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, had far more in common with indigenous victims of colonial violence than with whites who offered promises of freedom in exchange for aid in building an American empire. Indeed, this false promise of freedom conscripted Roberts into a system of imperial citizenship that had the effect not of ending slavery, but of strengthening it, by securing the North American West for white settler colonialism and vast slave plantations, and removing Indians beyond the ever-expanding borders of the nation. 2. Frederick Douglass recognized the importance of empire to slavery's survival from very early in his career. He dedicated one 1845 address in Belfast to explaining the burgeoning conflict with Mexico to his audience. In sum, he claimed, the United States recognized the independence of Texas for one purpose. The object was that of making Texas the market for the surplus slaves of the North American states. In the previous decade, the price of slaves in an oversaturated South dropped precipitously. Thus, new markets would be required to raise the price of slaves and keep the institution profitable. At the very moment he was witnessing the effects of unrestrained capitalism in England and colonialism in Ireland, Douglass articulated for the first time how capitalism and empire were at work in relationship to American slavery. Douglass was still in Great Britain when the Mexican-American War began. He made sense of the very violence of expansion into Mexico by taking recourse to the language of slavery. In a letter to abolitionist William White, he described Massachusetts politicians who participated in the, quote, the atrocious robbery of Mexico as comparable to sharks in the bloody wake of a slave ship. If the question of new slave territories outlined in the Missouri Compromise linked slavery to expansion politically, similar forms of racialized theft in land and bodies linked settler colonialism and slavery philosophically and ideologically. 3. One historian has noted, it was not the coincidental misfortune of the Filipino to fall under American jurisdiction at the very time when the American black man was suffering the climax of official segregation and statutory discrimination. And although both Filipinos and blacks were both commonly referred to as nigger, very few whites made any connection between domestic and imperial forms of racism. It was black writers, scholars, newspaper editors, and soldiers who linked the global practice of empire to white supremacy in the U.S. South as well as in the new American overseas possessions. Black observers held a range of positions on expansion. Some saw the U.S. foray into imperialism as a departure from the path of righteousness, while others understood it as the logical extension of a viciously racist society. But by the time Rudyard Kipling published his poem, The White Man's Burden, in 1899, the majority of black commentators believed that colonial expansion and racial violence in the South were two interrelated aspects of global white racism. The struggles of Cuban and Filipino revolutionaries, then, were another front in the same war black Americans were waging against Jim Crow, and blacks were able to translate these worldwide struggles into domestic idiom with remarkable fluency. Dozens of poems entitled The Black Man's Burden appeared within the year, registering the depth of opposition among black writers to the idea that imperialism could be as benevolent as Kipling suggested. These authors urged blacks to take up defense of the brown man where they had failed the red, in quotation marks. One Chicago man even organized a Black Man's Burden Association for the purpose of dramatizing the plight of Negroes in the United States and of depicting the treatment of the brown people in the Philippines as an extension of the government's domestic policy toward its own black citizens. So now I just want to come back to some of the ways in recent months that black Americans and Palestinians have expressed similarity in condition. You know, we see all sorts of images pop up. This one is pointing out that tear gas used throughout the world is manufactured by the same company. So, you know, you could add Brazil to this list. You know, many of you have probably heard that there was a fight about water shutoff in Detroit for residents who couldn't pay their bills. And this chart shows how much of the water supplies in Gaza are diverted for Israeli use. And so you see this is a a rally in Detroit, and you can see Palestinians and Black Americans holding up the same sign over this issue of the right to water. Last year, there started to be a segregated busing system in Israel. So rather than everyone from the West Bank who worked in Israel coming into Israel on the same buses, Jewish settlers demanded segregated buses because they didn't want to be on the same bus as Palestinians, citing, of course, security concerns, that there would just be a bomb on the bus and they would get blown to pieces. So this image highlights that similarity. But really the most fascinating one I found is this picture from a Purim festival. And these are high school students dressed up as members of the KKK, and then several in blackface with their hands tied. So when this happened, the principal of their school said she saw nothing wrong with the costumes. And one might be tempted to dismiss the incident as ignorance about the particular cultural context of lynching, but I think the condoning of this reenactment of white supremacists about to commit a racially motivated vigilante execution actually gives us insight into the racial architecture of Israel as a settler society. This image reminds us that in order to enact indigenous genocide and displacement, settler societies have drawn upon the same logics of anti-Black racism that the United States has used to keep Black Americans in their place, so to speak, since formal emancipation. In fact, since emancipation, there's been an enormous amount of crossover among those who built the southern system of segregation and those who engineered U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean and the Pacific. After the Civil War, those American intellectuals who wished to maintain white supremacy exchanged ideas with their counterparts in South Africa and Australia. Indeed, it's no coincidence that we often use the language of apartheid to describe the condition of Palestinians. In Israel, an imagined yet immutable racial line distinguishing Jews and Palestinians undergirds the occupation. Thus, the former Minister of the Interior was able to describe Israel as the country of the white man, despite the fact that until 2 decades ago, the majority of the population was made up of Arab and Middle Eastern Jews. In many ways, this absolute racial separation emulates how the United States and South Africa dealt with their Black populations, rather than the more flexible models of indigenous elimination that emerged in the US, Canada, and Australia, which could be enacted through forced assimilation. So you have, since Jefferson, this idea that natives could actually be assimilated into the white population through forced or voluntary breeding programs, essentially. So I just want to end with a brief personal anecdote. Both of my parents are very anti-Zionist. My mom is Lebanese, so it makes a little bit of sense. My father is from Haiti. And I remember once very clearly in 2011 or so, we were watching a story on CNN, and he said, "Justin, being from the first Black Republic, I know that occupation can't last forever." And so really what stays with me is this idea that my father's identity as Black is so bound up with a rejection of colonialism that the two are really inseparable. And so I'm not trying to make the claim that there aren't important distinctions to be made among Black, Indigenous, and colonized identities, but I am asking what it might mean to take the messiness and indeterminacy of statements like my father's and the expressions of interconnection we see between Gaza and Ferguson seriously, not necessarily as two discrete groups coming together in solidarity, but rather an occasion to reconsider how and why we ended up with two separate histories that need to be brought together in the first place. Thank you.
So I'm just going to read my Jewish reality. Before I do that, Veolia is the company that make it the big privatized Detroit water. And Veolia is the company that actually runs the rail line in Jerusalem. It's a whole long story. It's a big struggle against Veolia, which actually had deep investments in settlements in Israel. Okay, so I'm speaking as if I'm Majid. My current research is part of the Social Science Research Council program Inter-Asia, aimed at looking into rethinking Asia, the meaning of Asia, who is included in the term, and also to look at connections within Asia that have been marginalized in the academic work. but also in the public memory and knowledge about the peoples of the region, in their long history of communication, cultural flows within the continent, economic and political connections among peoples, groups, and states within Asia. My specific research examines the place of Israel in Asia, or the meaning of the place of Israel in Asia as a country and a leadership that sees itself and is perceived by Western leaders as European/Western, and whose Zionist leadership marketed the settler colonial project in Palestine as the West's front against the undemocratic backward Asia/East. That is a rhetoric that remains dominant and central in Israeli political and cultural discourse. By asking about the place of Israel in Asia, my research situates Palestine in the context of race, colonialism, settler colonialism, and modernity. Asking about the place of Israel in Israeli settler colonial society in Asia leads us to a related question. What is the place of native Palestinians in Asia? What are the political, economic, and and cultural consequences and connections if you were to think of Palestinians as West Asians rather than Middle Easterners? One of the goals of this research is to reframe the Palestine-Israel question. What does that reframing entail? How might it affect the ways in which we look at and understand the question, and what are the political, economic, social, and cultural implications for Native Palestinians themselves as a result of such reframing? Theoretically, I framed this work by engaging mainly with two schools of thought. The first is nomadology, as articulated by Duluth and Guattari in 1986, and its earlier, much more expansive framework articulated by the 14th century Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun. The second is settler colonialism. In this presentation, I will focus only on one part, settler colonial studies, especially the work of Fayez Said, 1965. By the way, you can download that pamphlet for free. It's really important to read. Fayez Said examined how Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine is built on and engages with dispossession, racial segregation, apartheid, racism, supremacy, elimination and displacement, denial and projection, and myth-making. Said further argued, an important point in my work, that the Israeli Zionist settler colonial case is part of Western colonialist and imperialist strategies implemented against Asians and Africans, initiated at the time when the peoples of these continents were at the height of their struggle for decolonization. Receiving little support from countries in the two continents, the exception being apartheid South Africa, and strong support from Western countries, the Israeli settler colonial project created a split between the two continents because Palestine is the only land that connects Asia and Africa. Hence, Israeli settler colonialism transformed Palestine from a connecting site for the mobility of peoples and political, social, economic, and cultural flows between Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean and beyond, to a site in a case of rupture locally, regionally, and globally. I shall explain this argument briefly. My own reframing grew out of a discussion I had with people in the Palestinian village in the Galilee about how/why the Zionist movement was able to colonize Palestine and dispossess its native population. We discussed different possibilities and factors, including the impact of the Holocaust, the hate of the West for the Arabs, the Jews being a more important part of the European Western culture, their familiarity with it, their ways of connecting to things there that made sense to Europeans, all resulting in their support. One of the discussants suggested that the Jews' historical connection to the Holy Land must have played a role in convincing Western leaders to support the Jews in creating a state in Palestine. In response, another discussant suggested that Zionists were considering a state in different parts of the world, and if the Jews were given a state in Uganda, which of course is one of the options Zionist leadership entertained, they would have found the Wailing Wall in Kampala. Right? This discussion made me think, what if indeed the Zionist project took place not in Palestine, but in other places discussed by Zionists and Western leaders, and if Israel was indeed placed in Africa, Asia, or Latin America? This led me to think about further reframing of the question of Palestine, beyond its Asian context. Specifically, how the idea of global Israel is more fitting to engage with the impact of the Israeli settler colonial state in Palestine. First, the nature of the Israeli settler colonial state created a dispersal of millions of Palestinians in Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, and the Americas, and thus made them global diaspora exiles, who naturally continue to have an attachment to the land and the people from whom they were separated. Second, the Zionist project claims to represent Jews around the globe, and indeed has brought in Jewish communities from all over the globe to manage this project. And Jewish communities around the world continue to engage Israel either by critiquing it or supporting it and agitating against those who critique the settler project. Finally, there was the obvious global religious attachment to Palestine/Israel. Hence, in thinking about the impact of Israeli settler colonialism, one must look at its local, regional, and global manifestations of ruptures and connections. Locally, with regard to native Palestinian and Palestinian society, Israeli settler colonialism has produced suffering, elimination, ethnic cleansing, displacement, dispossession, racism, repression, confinement, dislocations of social, economic, political, and cultural ties that existed prior to 1948 within Palestinian society and among the peoples and regions surrounding it. Regionally, the Israeli settler colonial state has also created a rupture and suffering in surrounding states through the creation of Palestinian displaced refugees, through Israeli wars on neighboring states, invasions, and displacing peoples from neighboring areas due to bombardments of border regions. Israeli settler colonialism has also contributed to the regional rupture by pushing for wars and sanctions against states in the regions, e.g. Libya, Syria, Iran, thus rupturing regional connections, economic, social, cultural, and political development. Globally, Israeli settler colonialism has also created a rupture by contributing to and transferring technologies of repression, as we heard from Justin, sharing and selling expertise in repressing dissent, technologies of confinement, technologies of surveillance, Israeli security companies at airports and elsewhere, and technologies of separation. In the case of Israeli companies working on the wall between Mexico and the U.S. Arms trade, including secret deals such as the Iran-Contra debacle, but also open weapon sales to states at war within and without in support for repressive regimes. Restriction on mobility and travel, not only to Palestinian diasporas, who are often prevented from freely traveling to Israel, Palestine, but also to those who are in solidarity with them. Okay. In some sense, this work is a conversation with John Collins, Global Palestine, where he argues that Palestine could be a site of global solidarity and connections around issues of race, war, suffering, displacement, incarceration, access to land and water, restriction on mobility, environmental degradation, and repression. My work looks at the other side of that coin, global Israel, a Western settler colonial project that, with the financial, diplomatic, political, and military support of key Western countries, has led not only to a rupture of the Palestinian society, but has been impacting people, societies, and states around the globe by the attention it receives, the energy spent on it, and its impact on individuals, groups, states, associations, and institutions, including academic institutions, students, and academics. The Stephen Salaita case is a suitable illustration of this point, where an academic in the U.S. of Palestinian origin and family members displaced and dispossessed by Israeli settler colonialism loses his tenured academic job for tweets critical of the Israeli state, and thus rendered doubly displaced and dispossessed by losing a job, a home, a decent future for him and his family. I'm not saying that all the problems of the world are caused by Israel, nor am I saying that all individual groups, associations, organizations, institutions, and states are equally impacted. Rather, my argument is that this nature of the Israeli settler colonial case sets itself apart from any other case of settler colonialism and constitutes an acute case of limiting and rupturing mobility and other central aspects of human activities and human nature. And this framing suggested here of global Israel is useful in thinking about the Palestine question as a global issue rather than a local one.
It's okay, I'm going to stand up. It's easier for me to project. It's really an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me and organizing this. Thank you, Robert, for moderating for us. So my paper is called Imperial Model Minorities Gone Rogue, Iranian Foreign Students in the Revolutionary Convergence. Just to begin with a little vignette, on December 6, 1967, hundreds of students gathered for a rally at San Francisco State College, as it was then known, to oppose the suspensions of 6 black students. The 6 were involved in an altercation with the staff of the campus newspaper over its campaign against the Black Student Union. Footage from the local KTVU news coverage shows a crowd gathered outside the locked administration building, chanting and pounding on the glass door. As the tension mounts, Khosrow Kalantari, a member of the Iranian Students Association, or ISA, kicks in the door and leads hundreds of students through the jagged-edged opening, starting a spontaneous building occupation that caused the college president to shut the campus down. And I'm going to attempt to show you the clip of just, because there is an archive of this footage, and I've just gone ahead to the little section showing what I just described. So the students are outside, they're pounding on the locked door. And that's Khosrow in the corner. Oh no. Oh, dear. Just hit allow? Or?
It's just going to take a minute to
Oh, okay.
This is the connection.
Maybe I got it.
You might want to hit pause to let it.
Okay. You know, we don't even need full screen. We can
There you
just. Okay.
Oh, it's started at the beginning.
Oh, I think it. Oh, it went back to the beginning.
That's okay. We can just,
All right.
we got time.
You know what? I'm gonna just play it with the volume. I need to. I mean, we could just watch it. It's like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes.
Yeah. We got
The nature of this society, which drives people to take the only means necessary to express their hostility, to express their alienation, and to attempt to liberate themselves. Emergency, mass meeting.
So now we're like back in time before that. This is when they lock the door.
classify it that strongly?
No, I wouldn't. I would say that the anarchy is perpetrated when law is violated, and the law is violated by the campus by not going according to due process in the procedures that have been taking place here.
What do you think, Professor, will be the result of what happened here today?
we will get at least to be able to voice our grievances. We will be able to impress upon those who don't know what's been happening a little more of what's been happening. Specifically, I expect that there will be administrative decisions against some students, certainly against myself.
Okay, this is the scene of the petition. So that's supposed to go all the way to the left. Okay, so that's how the application began. So Khusro and the other ISA members on campus would go on to participate in the student strike less than a year later that would culminate in the founding of the College of Ethnic Studies and historic transformations in the racial demographics of faculty and students. So rather than take this at face value as just another sign of the times, back then everyone was just radical, I think it's worth stepping back and asking what Iranians were doing in the front lines of this movement. After all, the issues reflected in the strike demands at SF State did not directly relate to their lives. ISA members never demanded increased Iranian admissions to college or the hiring of Iranian professors or the representation of Iranian points of view in the curriculum. Another ISA member, Hamid, who was also an honorary member of the Black Students Union, they called him Brother Iranian, he confirmed as much when he told me, no, we didn't have those demands. Those were for African American, Chicano, and Asian students. So the struggle at SF State is actually just one example of Iranian participation in the US social movements of the 1960s and 70s through the vehicle of the ISA. The ISA was the US affiliate of the Confederation of Iranian Students National Union. It was diasporic and transnational by necessity as college students left Iran by the tens of thousands to seek the benefits of a Western education, but also to escape political repression. Initially imagined as an organization representing the entire Iranian student population, like a student union, the Confederation quickly became defined by its anti-Shah activities and by various strains of Marxism, and it grew into the largest Iranian dissident movement abroad. As I will argue in more detail, the collective subversiveness of these students emanated from a different experience than that of their American peers. They were not reacting to exclusion from what Cheryl Harris has called whiteness as property. In this case, what she calls the status property enshrined in a college education. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of Iranians in the US before 1979 were here on student visas. On the eve of the Iranian Revolution, there were 50,000 Iranians enrolled in US colleges and universities. In addition, my research has shown that ISA members were generally not reacting to personal experiences of racial discrimination in the period before 1979 in the US. So why then did Iranian anti-Shah activists on dozens of campuses risk arrest and deportation to Iran, where they could also expect arrest and prison and likely torture as well, in order to protest racism in the US? In order to address this question, I'll first explain how the very presence of Iranian foreign students in the US exemplifies the title of this panel, Colonialism as Property, Whiteness as Colonialism, or in this case, Neocolonialism. If whiteness as property works as a mechanism regulating exclusion and inclusion within the nation state, then I will explore how whiteness as colonialism functions as a mode of assimilation into neo-colonial empire. I will then offer, because of space, really just like two examples from my case study of the ISA that illustrate what can happen when assimilation into that empire is actively refused. In her article, Whiteness as Property, Harris references post-1965 immigrants of different origins to whom whiteness as property was extended and who were encouraged to establish a superior identity in opposition to blacks. She might as well have been writing about Iranian students, a group of migrants from West Asia who were welcomed by the State Department and by university administrations alike, and given access to higher education and advanced degrees that was still systematically denied to poor and minority citizens. Following Harris's argument, we can understand acceptance into whiteness as a means of gaining access to an entrenched and protected system of privileges. For Asians in the US, this status could only be achieved through a highly contingent process of assimilation, idealized by the figure of the model minority. The Asian model minority may be granted a kind of honorary whiteness, but only on the condition that he or she forget about the US interventions in Asia and about the history of racialized exclusion of Asians in the US. Accessing whiteness as property is contingent upon identification with American nationalist doctrines of exceptionalism, opportunity, and individualism. As Asian American and ethnic studies scholars have pointed out, those doctrines were mobilized via the model minority category, this archetype, as a strategy for undermining the gains of the civil rights movement by counterposing Asian success to Black failure as proof that the system wasn't inherently racist, but rather rewarded those who helped themselves. The experiences of Iranian foreign student activists recast the figure of the model minority as an unstable site for competing political agendas on a global rather than a purely national scale. In other words, if the model minority ideal was wielded by politicians and the media in the mid-1960s in order to wage a war at home on those challenging the status quo, then how might it have correlated with the Cold War abroad? The inclusion of non-white, non-Western peoples into the American dream was, of course, also a pillar of US foreign policy. Western development models could not bring their promised prosperity, however, without the allegiance of an indigenous class of professionals with Western degrees. The American education of tens of thousands of Iranian students must therefore be understood as a necessary component of US imperial modalities throughout the Cold War, namely the establishment of client states led by pliable dictators and the institution of modernization schemes as an alternative to popular movements for self-determination. The best and brightest of Iran's college students were sent abroad in order that their hearts and minds could be better won over. These students were expected to return home to lucrative careers among the ranks of Iran's rising technocratic class, bolstering the American Cold War dream of global dominance through the spread of so-called progress. In short, they were offered a share of the wages of neocolonialism, to riff on David Roediger's formulation. They were sent to the US not only to master specialized technical knowledge, but also to internalize a worldview that positioned the US as both exceptional and universal. The journalist Walter Lippmann, who popularized the term Cold War, argued that, quote, the key to US domination was the affective capture of these aspirants and their training in the universal principles of freedom. ISA members' resistance to this affective capture represented just one iteration of a larger phenomenon. As historian Paul Kramer has noted, after World War II, government agencies, educators, and public intellectuals deemed foreign students, quote, critical actors in the global politics of the Cold War and decolonization, and prospective agents of US influence in the world to which they would eventually return. Thus, it was not only Iranians, but foreign students from Africa, Latin America, and other parts of Asia who were imagined and designated as what I'm calling imperial model minorities, as models of the universal human benefits of Americanization abroad, right? So if the domestic figure of the model minority was conjured in order to obscure the systematic oppression that remained after civil rights legislation, then the imperial model minority was intended to mask the harsh effects of combined and uneven development and police state conditions in allied third world nations. Kramer observes that this process, quote, sometimes spilled off the rails. When screenings failed to prune student radicals and dissenters, when students' lateral solidarities overtook hope for vertical loyalties, when encounters with the US state and civil society proved alienating rather than binding, end quote. For many Iranian student radicals, their alienation from the imperial model minority script was the result of events that had unfolded in Iran, rather than in reaction to racialized exclusion that they encountered in the US In the 1960s, the young people who joined the ISA were coming from a society that was pushing towards democracy until it was ambushed and hijacked by a CIA coup in 1953 that overthrew the elected president, Mohammad Mossadegh. Caught in the contradiction between their access to opportunity at US universities and the subverted Iranian sovereignty that allowed them that access, ISA members became a vehicle for what Lisa Lowe has called an imminent critique of a form of US empire that was virtually invisible at the time. ISA members told anyone who would listen about the coup, about the US-trained secret police force Savak that routinely tortured dissidents, and about how modernization had left the vast majority of Iranians poor and illiterate, and about the role the Shah played as a watchdog for U.S. interests in the region. And maybe we'll have more time in discussion to talk about what those interests were, because the Shah played a special role in defending Israel and funneling weapons to the South African apartheid regime as well. So there's a lot of important connections. This noisy refusal on the part of these students to leave their past behind, this insistence they had on speaking about injustices that had long been denied by both the Iranian and U.S. states, created an affective resonance with the freedom struggles of others who insisted on remembering the losses of slavery, racism, and colonization. Just a couple of quick examples. Parviz Shokat, who I interviewed for my dissertation research, he was a leading ISA member in the Bay Area and a founder of the underground Iranian Marxist organization, the United Communists. When I asked him how he became political, he recounted his childhood memories of the 1953 coup. In one memory, he's standing on his rooftop. He was from a very elite family, so his house was in the same neighborhood as the deposed President Mossadegh, and he was actually standing there watching as the Shah's agents ransacked the house and just trashed everything. In another memory, Parviz was present during the violent suppression of a taxi worker strike in Tehran. The first time Parviz was arrested was actually in Oakland at a rally to free Huey Newton. And this is what he said. It was after the demonstration, he explained. A policeman was hitting a very young girl on the street. We used to have these round wooden shields. I took one of those shields and hit the policeman on the back, and he fell on the street, and the woman got away, and I got away. But rather than leave the area, Parviz joined a Black Panther patrol that was monitoring police radios. He heard the cops say they were looking for him just a few minutes before Oakland's Blue Minis, the nickname for the special forces, turned up. Quote, "We went to Santa Rita prison," he said, "and there I refused to shave my beard, so they put me in solitary confinement. They poured water over me. It was 12 days. So this is just one example of how state repression became a transnational axis linking the struggle against dictatorship in Iran with the anti-racist movement here, and not simply as an ideology of anti-imperialism, but as something lived and felt. Of course, ISA members were not persecuted in the US the way the Panthers were. However, both organizations were in a constant state of campaigning to free political prisoners. For the ISA, it was the political prisoners in Iran. For the Panthers, it was their members here. The Bay Area chapters of each group showed their mutual support by regularly sending members to each other's rallies and meetings. One ISA message of solidarity in the January 1970 issue of the Black Panther newspaper describes the, quote, momentum of the Black liberation movement as one that will not only mobilize the masses of Black people, but also all progressive people in the US. Midway through, the article abruptly shifts into an almost prophetic register. Quote, "Think of such a force. What power can withstand a force of millions of revolutionaries refusing compromise and determined to destroy that which has denied their basic rights?" And this rousing, strident language contains, I think, more than just a message of solidarity. It expresses the hopes and desires of the Iranian student movement and of every other liberation movement underway at that time. While the article does not mention US support for the Shah or explain the link between foreign and domestic repression, the reader can feel the connection, can feel the author's own overwhelming desire for victory. Today, just to end, the history of the ISA has been buried under the authoritarian legacy of the Islamic Republic and the pro-Shah affiliations of the much larger diasporic population that immigrated here after 1979. Given the present conjuncture, in which the U.S. continues to disavow its imperial interests in the Middle East, yet violently pursue them in the name of democracy or fighting terrorism, in which domestic and transnational forms of racism and Islamophobia converge in anti-immigrant policies, mass incarceration, torture, and the militarization of daily life, it is crucial to recuperate the possibilities for solidarity that come from challenging both whiteness as property and whiteness as colonialism. In other words, by making the connections between different but related systems of privilege and dispossession. Thank you.
So we're going to hear from Nina Funny. I realized I didn't mention the title of your talks, which is Colonialism Without Colonies, Palestine, Iran, and Resistance to American Empire.
Thank you everybody for coming. It's really nice. Ironically, this wasn't my law school, but it's actually nice to be back. And it's nice to see familiar faces. I also want to thank everybody here for participating in this. And frankly, even more so than that for your body of work. The interventions that you all are making, I'm really excited about seeing, and what you're uncovering is not only politically meaningful to me, but also very personally meaningful, so I really appreciate it. So in January of 1987, 8 LA residents were arrested under a 1952 law that was mentioned in the last panel, the McCarran-Walter Act, which provided for the, quote, deportation of aliens who advocate the economic, international, and governmental doctrines of world communism, end quote. This launched one of the longest and most controversial immigration cases in U.S. history. Commonly called the LA 8, the defendants, 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan, were accused of being members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which represented a significant segment of the Palestinian left and was a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The U.S. government considered the organization a terrorist group, as it did many national liberation movements and left political parties throughout the world. Unlike today, however, there was no designated foreign terrorist organization list, formally classifying the organization as a terrorist formation. So just before one of the major hearings in the case, in April of '87, the Immigration and Naturalization Service dropped all the political allegations and pursued minor visa violations instead. According to FBI Director William Webster and the INS Regional Council here in LA, the objective of the case was to deport the 8 activists because of their alleged ties to the Palestinian left. In essence, the political allegations were dropped largely as a tactical legal move, and instead the government pursued minor immigration violations. At the time the case was filed, 6 of the defendants were on student or non-immigrant visas, and 2, Khader Hamida and Michelle Shihada, were permanent residents. Instead of the political allegations, the INS alleged that the 8 were deportable because they advocated the destruction of property, and later the INS added the charge that 2 of the defendants, Hamida and Shihada, were deportable because they advocated the unlawful assaulting or killing of government officers. The defendants obviously denied all the allegations. On January 30th, 2007, almost 20 years later, an immigration judge dismissed the deportation case against the last remaining defendants, calling the dragged-out deportation effort, quote, an embarrassment to the rule of law, end quote. The 8 were defended by the National Lawyers Guild. I have to do a shout-out to the NLG, the Center for Constitutional Rights, there's another shout-out, private attorneys here in Los Angeles and ACLU of Southern California. The legal question was quite narrow. It tested whether immigrants have the same First Amendment rights as citizens. The 8 had participated in activities organizing humanitarian aid fundraisers for Palestinians and distributed newspapers and flyers. When the case began, the 8 were arrested and held in maximum security units, and during the 20 years that this case lasted, they were under severe surveillance. Government agents had moved into the apartment next door to some of the defendants. Their phones were tapped and all their communications were monitored, which meant that many of the people they communicated with were also monitored. So imagine, for the activists in the room, imagine everybody that you call, every decision that you make is being heard. And so if you're calling somebody who's under investigation or being monitored, but you're not under investigation, your communications are being monitored as well. And so monitoring 8 people has the effect of targeting the whole movement, the practical effect. Some of the defendants were unable to acquire permanent work, and none were able to leave the country. Parents and relatives abroad grew old and died while the defendants were left here in the United States, unable to leave. Each time the defendants won in court, the government would create a new law and attempt to apply it retroactively to the defendants, getting them back into court proceedings. This is why the case lasted 20 years. And above all, it reflects the federal government's investment in the case. It was not a one-off immigration affair, and it certainly was not a minor prosecution driven by a lowly U.S. attorney based in LA. It was a political prosecution, begun up top in Washington, D.C., and propelled by the executive branch. The case was one of the bases for the creation of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996, and the designated foreign terrorist organization list used today by the FBI. And for those who don't know what that is listed, I can tell you in the Q&A. Or you can just look it up. It enabled the U.S. government to develop its own conception of the term terrorism, have it defined by the law, and applied in policy documents and police departments, FBI offices, and fusion centers throughout the country. That is, the case is not history, it is very much alive in our present. As part of discovery in the case, the government mistakenly released an otherwise confidential document to the defendant's attorneys. The document, called the Contingency Plan, outlined a program designed in the 1980s to place all Palestinians and Iranians residing in the United States in a concentration camp in Louisiana. Again, I want to repeat, a concentration camp in Louisiana. Reminiscent of the Japanese internment camps established during World War II, the camp location had been identified and the plan was fully outlined, but never implemented. It's no accident that the plan only targeted Palestinians and Iranians, as opposed to, quote, Arabs and Muslims, a term that we use a lot today. At the time, Palestinians were engaged in a militant national liberation struggle against U.S. colonialism, a colonialism propagated by one of the U.S.'s proxy powers, Israel. Iran had just undergone a sweeping revolution led by a large and active left, as Manija described, that removed the U.S.-backed monarchy and replaced it with what was at the time an anti-imperialist Islamic republic. People debate that a lot today, obviously. And immediately following the revolution, Iran was embroiled in what would become an 8-year-long war against U.S.-backed Iraq, which had sought to acquire territories in the south of Iran and was strongly supported politically, militarily, and financially by the U.S. In essence, the two represented left regional resistance to American empire at the time, in a region that was of great geopolitical importance, located at the junction of 3 continents, bordering 4 major bodies of water, and with vast oil and gas resources. And so it was that Iranians and Palestinians residing in the U.S., irrespective of their loyalties to the resistance, were slated for internment. Residents and non-residents, citizens and those without papers, all Palestinians and Iranians were merged into a category that went beyond just ethnicity, nationality, or religion. It was a category created from the regional politics of resistance to American empire. In Discourse on Colonialism, which is a book that Robin wrote a brilliant introduction to in the most recent edition, M.A. Cesar begins with an urgent question called, quote, the essential thing is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is, dangerously, and to answer clearly the innocent first question, what fundamentally is colonization, end quote. To follow his lead, I apply the same question to the contemporary period and to the U.S. in particular. I contend that American colonialism in West Asia has 3 critical characteristics. First, it is exercised by proxy. Second, it is built upon the backbone of racial power. And third, it is constituted by and through anti-communism, as the LA case reveals. I call this neocolonialism, and will address each. So, although neither Palestine nor Iran have ever been formally colonized by the U.S., they have both been subject to various forms of American neocolonialism. Palestinian land continues to be usurped by Israel, a state that, notwithstanding John Kerry's recent critiques, which people love to tout, is at the behest of American political power and political interest, and that rarely makes any moves without American backing. Iran was subject to U.S. control until 1979 via the puppet monarchy of the Shah, and today its economy is all but controlled by American-backed sanctions. The rest of the region, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Egypt, are undergoing American airstrikes, or embroiled in proxy wars, or are governed by American-backed military dictatorships, not unlike those of Cold War Latin America. The region is filled with American military bases, and American and Israeli warships travel its seas. Occupation no longer suffices as a sufficient descriptive tool for understanding American power in the region. Today, West Asia is subject to American neocolonialism, a colonialism without formal colonies. To use legal parlance for the lawyers in the room, it is not a de jure colonialism, it is a de facto colonialism. It is noteworthy that American neocolonial power is not uniform across the region. Historically, international political order has existed even in the absence of legal order. As Lauren Benton describes, precisely because imperial and colonial polities contain multiple legal systems, the location of political authority is not uniform across the international system. Yet international order in the imperial and colonial context depends upon the ability of different political authorities to recognize each other, as Israel and the U.S. do. So it goes that American colonialism can have order without law and can even exist without formal legalized colonies. Legal control is exercised unevenly across different terrains of power. For example, Palestine is subject to apartheid laws instituted by Israel but reminiscent of the U.S. and South Africa. Iraq's government structure has been transformed by the U.S. into a sectarian-based apparatus. And it's notable that Iraq had the region's largest communist party at one point, and Palestine had the region's first communist party. And Iran's economy is controlled by U.S.-backed sanctions. Another notable fact is that Iran's communist movement had acquired a great deal of political influence during the Cold War era and the Revolutionary era. Were it not for dynamics that are not a part of this paper, the movement in Iran was positioned to take power. But that's for another project, another day. And as America's power in the region expands, so too do its politics of racial control. Where American power is the strongest and most stable, as in Palestine and Iraq, racial control and race-based distinctions similar to those of Jim Crow America are more visible and more salient. Like the distinctions between Palestinians and Israelis, African Jews and European Jews in Israel, Shia and Sunni in Iraq, where up until recently, people identified as Iraqi, not necessarily as Sunni or Shia. Thus, even race-making is not uniform across the region. Racial practice has transformed over time. It occurs along different axes of identity and has been constituted by the various forms of power practiced there. And although the region vacillates from European colony to proxy war, to Western control, political control, to Western economic control, America's colonial trajectory in the region is not and has never been linear. This lack of uniformity and linearity manifests not just in the region itself, but in the U.S.'s dealings with immigrants from the region as well. In Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris identifies the evolution of whiteness, quote, from color to race to status to property, a progression historically rooted in white supremacy and economic hegemony over blacks and Native American peoples. And it's important to know, I hope somebody throughout the symposium talks about this, that this short statement, although very short, encapsulates how her article employed dialectical historical materialism as a tool not just of political and historical analysis, but legal analysis as well. This is how she was groundbreaking. I mean, there's a variety of ways that she was groundbreaking, but her use of dialectical historical materialism in the law was truly groundbreaking, and it has not really been done yet. Again. So immigrants from West Asia have undergone their own evolution that overlaps with the one Harris outlines above. This evolution, from settler labor to immigrant to communist to terrorist, is historically rooted in white supremacy and economic hegemony, as Harris describes, but a supremacy and hegemony that results from American colonialism abroad. Admittedly, the racial status of the peoples from this region residing in the U.S. has yet to be identified. Sometimes formally colonized as white, at other times Asian, at other times a box unto ourselves. There are court cases that have identified Iranian and Arab each as their own distinct racial categories, and academic scholarship continues to focus on Muslims as an emerging and specific racial category of its own. In this way, the lack of uniformity and linearity present in American colonial power is reflected by the law here as well, and even shows up in immigration law, where both Iranians and Palestinians, and Arabs more broadly, are virtually treated by whole bodies of law designed specifically for them. This includes, this includes trig regulations. Trig regulations are terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds. Regulations often used to restrict Palestinian access to resident status and material support laws so broad and ambiguous that they virtually preclude anyone who has even breathed in the presence of a foreign terrorist organization from attaining U.S. citizenship. The original organizations on the foreign terrorist organization list, not surprisingly, were communist political parties. So, for the U.S. colonialism in West Asia, which emerged during the Cold War era, is a fundamentally anti-communist political project, revealed through the lavish treatment of the region's communist parties, American support of everyone there but the left, and the creation of whole new bodies of law that criminalize communism. Today, these policies are used to target other communities as well, but they began as a result of the LA 8 case and the targeting of the Palestinians. To conclude, as the LA 8 case and the contingency plan reveal, immigration policy is nothing more than the domestic arm of U.S. foreign policy, a policy that is advanced by proxy, exercises American racial power abroad, and is fundamentally anti-communist in its foundations, its origins, and its manifestations. In that way, U.S. immigration law is historically rooted in both white supremacy, as Cheryl Harris argues, and anti-communism. The three are mutually contingent, making and remaking one another as history advances.
Publications is publications. So we have about 17 minutes for questions, conversations, all that stuff.
I was curious about the broader extent of your project.
Yeah.
I'm curious beyond just the Iranian students. So have you investigated at all the Vietnamese Students Association and their work against the war, against the war in Vietnam, and I'll explain the connection. The work of Judy Wu, the Asian Americanist from Ohio State, was written about Asian women's third world anti-imperialist movements. Are you familiar with that topic?
Thank you for the question. I am not familiar with Judy Wu's work, but I'm now very excited to investigate and learn about
The
it.
personal link that key characters in that is my wife.
Oh, okay.
Everything you're writing about, including San Francisco State,
Well,
liberal studies.
I do write about, so in the larger project is Iranian diasporic subjectivity across, from 53 to basically the present moment, so it's too big. But in the historical section, I write about the Iranian student participation in the anti-racist movement, the anti-war movement, and also Palestine freedom struggle. Those are the three case studies that I take because those were the three kind of major areas of cross-pollination between movements that I found. So the Vietnamese Students Association comes up because it's in the archive. They had joint meetings, joint rallies, joint film screenings. They were organizing together on campuses. But I haven't independently interviewed, say, veterans of the Vietnamese Students Association. That would be an even bigger project, and to see sort of their experience of the same movement. But the Vietnamese Students Association does come up in the same archive with the Iranians. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Hi, I guess I'm an activist more than an academic, and I lived under the shadow of the model minority, being raised here, and my parents are from Hong Kong, so I guess sometimes I feel like I'm fighting for the sake of fighting. In other words, I guess anytime there's an anti-colonial, and I'm thinking about Hong Kong right now, struggle going on, I want to be on the streets. If not there, then I'm in a solidarity protest. I've done a lot of Palestine solidarity. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I feel like the framing of anti-colonialism is so limited to the aspect of American colonialism. And for me, the reality of any sort of successful anti-colonial struggle has been either kind of an association afterwards with state capitalist, state communist, a regime that ends up being authoritarian, or even if they're not aligned, it ends up being, very authoritarian in how they set up society afterwards. And so, looking at Hong Kong presently and how dominated it is by students who are very skeptical, at least the mainstream narrative, of any sort of radicals there on the street, on the one hand, and even workers, like the 40-day strikers last year, the poor dock workers in Hong Kong, are not affiliating themselves with the mostly student struggle in Hong Kong. And so for me, there's like problems, red flags all over. So I guess my question is, how would you reconcile, I guess, that sort of contradiction in supporting or being in solidarity with anti-colonial struggles and this, this realistic, fatalism that I can't break free from?
Is that
Anyone?
That's for anyone. Really.
okay? I mean, I could take a stab at it. Okay. Well, I mean, thank you for, this is really a key question in the Iranian context as well, and it would make sense in the Chinese. What do you do when a decolonization movement, results in an oppressive state regime, right? And this has happened again and again. And so part of my project is to recuperate the sense, rather than to see that in a fatalistic, way, to recuperate the sense of possibility from those movements at the time, right? That there was nothing inevitable that the Iranian Revolution would result in, as you were referencing, the state that came about. There was nothing inevitable about that, and that we kind of can't. We can neither be uncritical of those states, nor can we dismiss the movements because they resulted in those states. So we occupy this very uncomfortable, difficult place of trying to maintain anti-imperialist politics, even when they have been co-opted and become the official discourse of the states, right? Like the Iranian state, for example. So that is the challenge. What does revolution mean when the Islamic Republic uses it all the time as a way to actually suppress dissidents within Iran, right? So what it can do is it can discredit the whole radical anti-imperialist project, and we see that fallout in the diaspora, especially where people understandably are, very, very wary of anything communist, left, radical, revolution, even alienated from the Palestinian struggle because that's been co-opted by the Iranian state, and so these produce all kinds of chasms that prevent solidarity, that prevent, people from being able to organize for some alternative, right? And we end up kind of stuck with the status quo. So I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think that that's what a lot of us are trying to grapple with, is how do we reformulate or reclaim an anti-imperialism that is not in the service of those state projects, right? That actually can imagine something other than that. And I think it's been useful for me, at least, to go back to the diasporic wings of these anti-colonial third worldist movements because of the cross-pollination that was going on with anti-racist Black power, with other, you get a sense of an era and a possibility before we had these outcomes that I think is really worth remembering and holding on to for what it might mean today. Sorry.
Okay, just wanted.
Sorry, just quickly. So Fanon talks about this. It's a comment. After the revolution, the people who take over have historically been problematic in a lot of places. And it's largely a class issue, but there's all kinds of issues. For me, because I'm very involved in activist work as well, my location here in the US is critical and central to the positions that I take. I was born here, I grew up here, I pay taxes here, for better or for worse, and so my site of struggle, my primary site of struggle is the United States. I know the situation here, I'm familiar with it, I live it. If I face political repression, it impacts me, it won't hurt my family back in Iran. And so I speak about Iran every once in a while, but I make a strategic political decision to do work here in the US about the US. That said, I think it's really important to not live in the binaries of these discussions, the dichotomies that frankly it's these elite state powers that they produce to highlight and to uncover the nuances and the depth of the various questions. I mean, there are a lot of things that, I'll just say it's just really important to highlight the nuances of both questions, of what's happening in both places.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. Let me just quickly say, we don't have time to get into this issue, but read Trotsky.
Criticism of Trotsky.
Permanent revolution. No, don't mean people who speak for Trotsky, but on permanent revolution.
Right.
The idea of permanent revolution.
Yeah.
The idea that somehow you achieve revolution through state power is just ridiculous.
Right.
Yes.
And so there's all kinds of things in all these papers that actually demonstrate why that's not the case. And I can't get into it, but even the issue of the sort of what neocolonialism actually, how it functions, is really important for understanding why is it that certain forms of oppression are not just simply reproduced, but produced differently. And even in the name of socialism, whatever. But like I said, there's all kinds of people walking around campus that give you papers about Trotsky. Forget them. Go back to read Trotsky himself. You know. Okay, now I'm going to take the three questions, and then we're going to have responses. So you're first.
Okay. Thank you all for this very insightful panel. I have a question that can be very basic or very complicated, depending on how you look at it. But as West Asian people, I guess, how do we make sense of the idea of being like technically white as per U.S. Census, but literally the other against which whiteness is constructed, right? So like this idea of like Afghans, being explicitly listed as white, but then being the actual other. I mean, does that mean that the Taliban are white? Is that a thing? Like, how do you make sense of that political whiteness as opposed to like social otherness?
The question of going back to what Dr. Nasrabadi, what you were talking about in terms of reclaiming anti-colonialism. What happens when the cultural mechanism that we're working with or operating with doesn't see anti-colonialism as anti-statist or anti-capitalist, but operates on a level of a crude sense of anarchy, saying that, and I'm thinking back to some of the writings during the Haitian Revolution by Thomas Jefferson and others, saying that the U.S. must fear the fate of San Domingo, right? What happens when any possibility for self-determination or some other kind of forward-moving activity is seen as chaos and therefore is stigmatized as such?
Erica, you have the last question.
Thanks. So just a plug for Jadaliyya. For those of you who read it, there's going to be a forthcoming piece that tries to unpack the idea of why oppose sanctions on Iran and support boycott from Israel. So just add to this conversation. My question is for Nina, or I should say Dr. Harney. Hi. And so I have a question and a comment. The comment has to do with the observation that how plenary power is specifically located in Congress, but also in the executive branch, how that operates as the domestic branch of what our foreign policy looks like. And so this is a theme in critical race studies about the relationship between Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution and how that constructs race in the US. I just want to add that there's a lot of work also that looks at the relationship between the judiciary and the executive that works to do the same thing of how that foreign policy is then reified within the US judiciary in ways that, for example, shield its interests, primarily Israel, and its holdings, and prosecute almost as a matter of fact with executive sanction and legislative endorsement Arabs and Iranians and Palestinians. And so the recent case is the Arab Bank case that was just decided in district court in New York. And then the comment is this: you emphasize that this is about colonies without colony, right? And I wonder why that emphasis. That isn't neocolonialism, in fact, just that. It's precisely a colonialism, in fact, without this physical presence. And so how does that distinction help us to better understand U.S. imperial intervention in the Middle East in ways that we didn't looking at looking at neocolonialism as a frame. And so because it seemed to me that there's a lack of linearity, but there's also a lack of colonies, and yet, so we're trying to fit it in this framework, and why did the other framework not suffice?
Yeah, so I think what is actually happening is a recolonization process. So I think we're in the early stages. Haiti is a prime example. I think Haiti is an excellent example. And parts of the Middle East, West Asia. I still have to purge Middle East from my lexicon, and Africa as well. And so the reason that I choose neocolonialism and treat it in this way is because I see it as a step, like a prefigurative step toward recolonization. I don't, the hip thing these days is to say that American empire is on the decline. I'm not convinced. I think it's on the rise. And I think Obama has done wonders for American empire, such that whoever takes over next will be able to start moving it forward very effectively.
Your question, sir, about I mean, you know, I could produce quotes about the, you know, the movement for oil nationalization in Iran, a movement for self-determination, from U.S. government officials calling it anarchy, chaos, a mob, right? It's mob violence. That's why we have to send in, you know. I mean, I think the people in power who are threatened by these movements, they always characterize them. They never say, actually, people are very well organized and have a really clear political program and have really, you know, read their whatever, you know. I mean, right, this is how they're always characterized as a chaotic mob that needs to be reined in. So I think that's, you know, I think that whether or not that characterization is compelling or convincing depends on who you are, right? And the strength of a movement to put forward its own representations of itself. But I think that that's always part of the, you know, the struggle, yeah.
But it also sort of, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, gets at this question of how do we make sense of, you know, racialization in this region? Because of course, there's no racial language in this condemnation of being anarchistic or a mob, but of course it's completely racializing and about civilizational discourse, and it shows the inadequacy of you know, legal frameworks for describing race in that literal way when it's actually emerges from such a complex nexus of anti-communism or anti-various leftist positions.
Got Holly Wyman in the audience.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment on this question. And given the new
It's like
edition.
law school when they call you and you haven't read your head.
It's like a call on you, right?
I will say one quick thing. I think that we are facing a particular political crisis now which hasn't been not theorized yet, and I do think it has major racial implications. And that is the question of the limits of direct democracy. We have such an investment in it. Obviously, Tahrir or Occupy or many other Hong Kong now have, and then other examples, Maidan and so on, and many examples. We have such a commitment to this, and I share that commitment that people mobilized and in the street can confront oppressive states, but it's clear that there has been developed on a world scale, and certainly in the U.S. vis-a-vis Occupy, a counter strategy which is very, very effective, repressive strategy, and that also points to your anarchy question. I don't have an answer to that problem, but I do want to flag it as a problem. How can we defend direct democracy in these really new circumstances?
I should answer your question. So, are you affiliated with the Critical Race Studies program at all? No. You're not? Okay. because this question, when I was, it's every single year, the few Iranian, Arab, and South Asian students bring this question up and say, well, what are you doing about us? We had so many discussions here. Very wonderful discussion. We weren't always white. In the early 1900s, the law went back and forth on us. And if you read the cases are called the racial prerequisite cases. You can find, Ian Haney Lopez wrote a book about them, but there's been tons of scholarship on it. And the rhetoric clearly suggests that they never thought of us as white. They really saw us as savages. They justified themselves in calling us savages very eloquently. It's only recently that we've joined whiteness.
Well, post 9/11, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, no, I meant during the Cold War era.
Exactly.
During the
But
Cold
you're
War.
right, back and forth.
Yeah.
It's like back and forth.
So, that's what I was going to say.
Okay, I know, I thought that, but you're Jeffrey.
It's very interesting, your comment, the way the issue of passing comes throughout the article, that deploys a whole conversation about, the inside or outside of it, like the Harlem Renaissance, and particularly, what do you do with that limited time-limited status of being on the inside? How do you use that positionality to do something different, which I think is a real challenge.
Well, let's thank our speakers. And make you stick around for more conferences.
Just saying it.